Well, hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you are here with us today for this month's Wednesday webinar. Today's session is on how to help your students get ready to file the 24-25 FAFSA. Lots of changes coming, so very different than it's been in the past. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the manager of College Access and Outreach, and so I'm going to be your presenter today. But with me is the fabulous Nikki Vachon. I'm so glad that Nikki is here with me. And Nikki is going to be watching the questions. So what we're going to do, and I hope this works for everyone, is we are actually going to turn off the chat. Not because we don't want questions, just the exact opposite. We're going to turn it off. I just did, because what we want you to do is we want you to put your questions in the Q&A. When you put them in the Q&A, it ensures we won't miss them. It also lets us keep better track of them so that when we follow up on any questions we don't answer during the session, we'll be sure that we don't miss any. So thank you for that. We really do invite your questions. What I want to be sure you know is that we are recording this. It will be posted to our website. And when I send the email out later this week, as a recap, I will send the slides. Again, I sent them earlier today, but I'll send the slides again, as well as the link to the presentation and any other materials and resources that we hope will be helpful. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So FAFSA simplification, that's what's been going on. We've been focused on this all summer long. We certainly started before the summer, but we've really this summer made it an absolute priority to understand all of the changes that are around FAFSA simplification. It is really going to change our fall and be very different than it has in the past. FAFSA simplification represents the most significant overhaul in the FAFSA in 40 years. So, you know, these are big changes, and I know if you're new to this and you've never been involved with a FAFSA before, you probably don't really care what it used to be like. You care what it's going to be like now. But for those of us who've been doing it for a bit, we're going to find that the FAFSA process is going to change, the form itself is going to change, and the underlying formula is going to change. All of this is being updated. And what you might have heard already is that the FAFSA is being delayed until December. Because of all of these changes, they basically, the federal government, Department of Ed said, we can't get it ready for October 1st. So it's delayed until December. We don't have the exact date. We will let you know when we do. And hopefully we will know that soon, but sometime in December. We will be back to October 1st next year. So typically the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st, and it will return to October 1st. So this is just a 1-year change that will go back to October 1st next year. Now, why are we experiencing all of these changes? All of these changes to the FAFSA are a result of multiple pieces of legislation, but there are two in particular that I want to highlight. The first is the Future Act, and this actually passed in 2019 and was part of one of those big omnibus bills that happen at the end of the year oftentimes. And basically, one of the things that was included in the Future Act was the ability for information from the IRS to be transferred directly to the Department of Education. And so this is really relevant when it comes to completing the FAFSA. It's also relevant for any of you who have federal student loans and maybe do income-based repayment. That same process is working there. So the idea is let's have the two big departments under the federal government actually talk to each other and exchange information. That's the concept behind the Futures Act. Now, what I will say though, is this is going to make the FAFSA easier, but what it also means is because the information is coming directly from the IRS and going directly to the Department of Ed, the privacy requirements, the security requirements have really been ramped up. And so that is impacting how students are filing the FAFSA and specifically impacting how we use FSA IDs. And so we're going to talk more about that today. But then the second act that passed the following year as part of a big omnibus bill was the FAFSA Simplification Act. And that legislation was really the piece that included all of the changes to the form and the formula. So it's really these two things together that are resulting in the significant changes that we're experiencing. So when we talk about FAFSA simplification, that is the same term that you want to be thinking about if you hear better future. So better future is the term that the Department of Education, Federal Student Aid specifically is using. So they have tagged this Better FAFSA, Better Future. So when you hear us say Better FAFSA, we mean the same thing. We mean all of these FAFSA simplification changing. And what we all do hope is that this is going to result in a FAFSA that is better and easier to complete. It is supposed to be more streamlined. What we've seen so far looks really promising. A reduced number of questions, a dramatically reduced number of questions. And so that's wonderful. Expanded eligibility for Pell Grants and more transparency. And one of the things that might not seem like a big deal, but for many of you who worked on the FAFSA the last several years, to have a more secure and stable platform. I think Nikki and I and everyone else out there who spends a lot of time doing this has spent literally hours over the years watching the spinning, blue circle. So we're being told that this is going to be a FAFSA that performs much better. All right, I wanted to start off with a really quick poll. We're going to do a couple of them. But this first poll, I just want to get a sense of where everyone's at. We've got a large group today. So what I would like to know is, could you please estimate for me your current knowledge regarding FAFSA simplification and the changes that are being made to the FAFSA? And this will help me really get a better sense of how deep I want to go, how surfacey I want to go as we go through this today. All right, great. We are just watching the percentages here just to make sure we get everyone's feedback. Okay, this is super helpful. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here. And as you can see, we have a lot of people who this is very new. You either know a little bit about it or a bit more familiar, but still very new. So that's really helpful. Now, one of the things that I want to let you know for today is there's going to be repetition in this presentation, and that is intentional. So the way I've structured this one is that we're going to spend the first half or so looking at the changes and kind of talking about what the changes are. And then the second half, we're going to talk about what we would love to have all of you kind of thinking about and what we're doing to help students and families get ready for the fall. And it's actually going to repeat some of the stuff we talked about earlier. That's intentional. We have a lot of trainings we're doing. There are enough changes that trying to take everything in one presentation isn't possible. For a matter of fact, I'm probably only touching on about a third of the changes that are happening today, but we do have additional trainings and I'll share those at the end. So let's dive in by talking about some terminology. In some cases, terminology is changing. In other cases, it's just brand new terminology. So one of the first that you maybe have heard about already is that the EFC, or the expected family contribution, is going away. This has been renamed to be the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. This is really just a change in the name. The SAI will work very similarly to how the EFC has worked in terms of what schools do with that information, but it is a name change. And bonus points here for anyone who had heard this. Guess what the EFC was before it was the EFC? You've got it. It was the SAI. So what is old is new again. And then we have the term contributor. So this is a new term, and this is referring to anyone who is required to provide consent and approval on the FAFSA. So we're going to talk a lot more about that today. But possible contributors are going to be the student. The student is always a contributor. Parent, potentially the other parent, if parents are married, and the student's spouse, depending on certain circumstances. So we're going to go deeper into all of that. But what I want you to know is that when you hear the term contributor, which they did not consult Nikki and I about, we would not have picked this term, but contributor simply means someone providing information on the FAFSA. We want to be really clear that in no way is it requiring a parent to, or anyone else to, contribute to the student's education. Some will, we know that. Some won't, we know that. Contributor is just talking about contributing information to the FAFSA. And then there's the direct data exchange. This is a term we need to get used to, but the one we can throw out, and we're happy to, is the IRS data retrieval tool, which has always not worked as well as we would have liked. So what we're excited about now is there is going to be a direct exchange of federal tax information from the IRS. directly to the Department of Education. So that should work a lot better. They're matching directly on Social Security numbers. Good news there. That information that's being transferred from the IRS over to the Department of Education is going to be referred to as federal tax information, or FTI. So FTI is another one of those acronyms that we're building into our vocabulary, and it's going to get used a lot. FTI includes obviously income, taxes paid, but also things like family size and whether or not there was a tax return on file, because not everyone has to file. So FTI is an important term that's a bit broader than I thought initially. So this is the information again that's going to come over from the IRS. But what I want you to know is that you're not going to see it in the FAFSA. Again, this FTI information is super protected. So it's actually going to live in a little module beside the FAFSA. So that's where the income pieces will get calculated. But going forward, when information is shared by the IRS with the Department of Education, we will not see that on the FAFSA. And we will not see it on what's currently called the Student Aid Report. It is now going to be called the FAFSA Submission Summary. Schools, of course, will get that information. But the rest, anyone who's just looking at the FAFSA or looking at that summary statement, not going to see any of that information. And then just a few more terms I want to talk about. Consent and approval, another new one that we are talking about a bunch. Contributors, and we're going to talk again about contributors even more, must provide consent and approval to use their information from the IRS so that they can calculate their eligibility, that it can go to the Department of Ed, where the eligibility will get calculated, and then that it can get redisclosed to the schools and other organizations. I have talked about a couple of terms, some that are brand new. This was me saying it for the first time, but I'm going to repeat several different times what these terms mean and how they're used. So if you're sitting there thinking, gosh, Mila, you talk fast, which I try hard not to do, and I don't know that I got 10% of what you just talked about, that's okay, because this was just piece number one. We're going to go over this several times today, and in all of our trainings all fall long. A couple of other terms that we're not going to talk as much about today, but we will in our other trainings, is we want to talk about family size going forward. This has been called household size. We're now talking about family size. Slight change in this as well, because in the past, family size didn't necessarily align with what was on a tax return. But now going forward, that information is going to be shared from the tax return, and that's what's going to determine what a family size is. It is updatable. And in a different presentation, we will talk more about that. And as I've already mentioned, the Student Aid Report has been renamed, and it is being called the FAFSA Submission Summary, which of course makes a lot more sense. All right, so enough about terminology. Now let's take that terminology that we've talked about and let's try to put it into practice and see where you're going to hear it and how things are going to be used. So one of the big changes to the FAFSA is the fact that it's going to be roles-based. So how it is going to work is that a student will log into their section of the FAFSA, and they will only see their questions, their demographic questions, where they went to high school, where they want the information sent, to what colleges, for example. Students will see only that information. Parents will log into the parent section, and they will only see their information. So they'll see their demographic information, and in both cases, they're going to see their own questions related to, assets and things like that. Okay. So very different, not one long form anymore, but two segments that will be connected to each other. Now, how do they get connected to each other? Whoever starts the FAFSA, and either a student can start the FAFSA or a parent can start the FAFSA. I'm really focused today on dependent students, okay? Whoever starts it will invite the other parties, the other contributors, to join them and to finish their section of the FAFSA at their convenience, either pretty much immediately or several days later. So a student can start the FAFSA and invite their parent contributors, or the parent can start the FAFSA and invite the student. Okay. Now, again, this being a roles-based form, the individual who starts the FAFSA will invite, as I just said, those other contributors. Here's a key piece that we want everyone to know is that when I invite a contributor, for example, if I started as a parent, the information I'm going to have to provide includes the other individual's legal name. So let's just say I'm the parent, I'm starting the FAFSA. I want to invite my son, Noah. I'm going to have to provide Noah's legal name, as it is on his social security card, his date of birth, his social security number, and an email address. All of those pieces of information are required in order for me to invite him to complete his portion of the FAFSA. The reason this invitation is so important is it's because it's how these two pieces are going to be connected. So otherwise, we just have a student application and then the parent information. They've got to connect. This invitation is what connects them. It's critical that the information that's used to invite whoever matches the FSA ID information correct, 100%, okay? So the name has to be the legal name as it exists on the social security card and is used to create an FSA ID. Same with the date of birth, and that social security number has to be provided. So what we're going to talk about as we go through all of this is that there is an option as to whether the student starts it or the parent starts it. I think sometimes we're going to lean towards the parent starting it because parents may not want to share their social security numbers with their students, but we'll provide more guidance on that as we go through. The only piece of information that doesn't have to match exactly with the FSA ID information is the email. So say, for example, I know that Noah created his FSA ID and he used this email account, but I know that now he uses a different email account and that's the one he's actually going to check. I can use that different email address, okay? So name, social, date of birth have to match FSA ID information. Email does not, but email address does have to be provided. All right, let's do another poll. And this one here is going to be about inviting contributors. So if a student starts the FAFSA can invite a parent contributor to complete the FAFSA as long as they have the contributor's name, date of birth, and email. And I wasn't intentionally trying to make this a trick question, but I might have. For a matter of fact, I reread it myself when I was prepping for today and said, ooh, okay, all right. We've got a good percentage so far. I'm going to wait just a second more and let a few more people answer this. All right, I'm going to end it there. So we've got a bit of a mixed bag. 72% say that is false, or 71% now say that's false, and 29% said true. The 71% is correct. That is false. The other key piece of information that is required is that social security number. So this was something that we're going to talk about a lot this fall as we're getting ready to do FAFSAs, is making sure that people have a plan in place to share social security numbers with whoever starts the FAFSA and whoever is a contributor on the FAFSA. All righty. Another small change is a definition to parent on the FAFSA. So starting with the 24-25 FAFSA, the parent who provides the greater financial support is going to be the parent responsible for filing the FAFSA or completing the FAFSA. So trying to relearn myself, right? Been doing this for a long time. I am so used to the parent on the FAFSA in the case of a divorce situation, or where parents aren't married, that it's the parent the student lives with most for the last 12 months. That's the way it's been since I started in financial aid. That is changing. It is now going to be the parent who provides the greater portion of the student's financial support, okay? Sometimes that's going to be exactly the same. If they were living with one parent most of the time, that's probably still going to be the parent who is providing most of the financial support, but not always. So we have to revisit this and give this thought as we're completing FAFSAs or getting ready to complete FAFSAs. Within the FAFSA, there will be what's called a parent wizard that will help with all of this. Now, just a reminder that if I have a situation where parents are divorced, and I've identified that mom is the parent that provides the majority of the financial support, then the next piece I have to add is mom currently married? And if mom is currently married, her spouse will also need to provide financial information. Okay, that's not new. That is, but it's always a piece that people don't like, to be honest with you, and that people are surprised by. I literally have told people that, you might really want to think about getting remarried while you have kids in college, because it's, are you married as of the day you file your FAFSA? And if you are, that other person's information is required. Again, not new, but just want to restate because it does catch people off guard. So let's talk a little bit about FSA IDs. Now, as a reminder, what an FSA ID is people are going to set up an account with Federal Student Aid, FSA. And when they set up their account, they're going to create a username and password. And this username and password is what they will use to access all all studentaid.gov websites, including the FAFSA. Okay. So these have been around since May of 2015. So this is not new, but some things related to the FSA ID are new. There will no longer be the option of starting a student's FAFSA using demographic information. So currently, I could start FAFSA for my son just by going in and typing in his demographic information. That will no longer be an option. The only way to get into any portion of the FAFSA will be with an FSA ID. Okay, so everyone, who needs to have one is going to have one. There's no longer going to be kind of a workaround. Now, this I'm going to restate a couple of different times today and ongoingly through the fall. We have to think about who needs to provide information on the FAFSA, and then additionally, who has to provide consent and approval on the FAFSA. Consent and approval on the FAFSA, again, is us saying that we authorize the IRS to release and share our information. So in the case of a married couple who file a joint tax return, it's going to stay kind of like it has. Only one parent will need to have an FSA ID because only one parent will have to log into the FAFSA and provide consent. And that's because married joint filers can provide consent for each other because they filed a joint tax return. Okay. So I filed a joint tax return with my husband. If I'm going in and doing a FAFSA, his information is going to be listed, but I can provide consent and approval for both of us. But if we have parents who are married, but for some reason they decide to file their tax returns separately, then both parents are now going to have their own FSA IDs and sign into the FAFSA separately because each of them is going to have to provide consent and approval. So you cannot provide consent and approval if your name isn't on that tax return, even if you're married, okay? So for married couples that file separately, each parent is going to have to provide consent and approval, so therefore each one is going to need an FSA ID. That's a little bit different than it's been in the past. If parents are not married but live together, then both parents are going to need to have their own FSA IDs. They'll each need to log into the FAFSA and provide consent. Another slight tweak to the FAFSA is that an FSA ID will need to be matched with the Social Security Administration before it can be used. And so typically that takes a couple of days. We're asking people to plan on it taking a week. Where this is different is in the past, we would have events, you might all have events, where people could just show up. They'd done nothing. And at that event, they could create their FSA ID and they could use it immediately to file the FAFSA and get it submitted that night. That is no longer going to be the case. What's going to have to happen is people are going to have to get their FSA ID, wait for it to be matched, and then they can go in and do the FAFSA and submit it. Again, this is the security stuff behind the scenes. They need it to be matched with the Social Security Administration because, again, they want to be sure that only people with verified information are providing consent to the IRS. So we're going to talk a little bit at the end about how we're planning to deal with that this fall in terms of helping students and parents get ready. Every time an FSA ID is used, two-step verification is going to be required, which really means that people have got to be on the same page. I no longer can just go in and do a FAFSA for my son. I could do his section theoretically if I have his FSA ID, but at a minimum, he's going to have to provide the verification code to me. So this again is very different. In the past, students didn't need a verification code at all until last year. And then slowly but surely, all students had to have one, but parents didn't. Now everyone is going to need to get that verification code and sign in using that verification code every single time they log into a FAFSA. And then last but not least for this little section is that individuals without an SSN will be able to create an FSA ID. That has never been possible. What has happened to date is that people without a Social Security number would basically sign a paper signature page. The paper signature page is going to be gone, but in its place, people without an SSN will be able to create an FSA ID. We don't know all of the details of this process. Our understanding is that people's identity will be verified instead of through Social Security, will be verified through TransUnion, but there's much more to come on this, and we will share this information as soon as we have it. But definitely know that you have families that in the past wouldn't have been able to get an FSA ID that are now going to be able to. Now I want to talk a little bit about the direct data exchange. Some of this I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but I think that I always debate, should I talk about this first or FSA IDs first? So the direct data exchange, again, is where federal tax information, or FTI, is going to be imported into that FTI module that basically lives beside or is adjacent to a student's FAFSA. Okay, so they won't see that information in their FAFSA, but it will be there connected with their FAFSA so that their eligibility can be determined. Every contributor will need to provide consent and approval in order to have their federal tax information imported and redisclosed. Even non-tax filers. So this is one of those things where I know we're going to get a lot of questions on this, because people are going to say, well, why do I need to provide consent if I don't have taxes on file? And it's because one of the things that gets determined, or information that gets grabbed when there is that sharing of information from the IRS, is a person's tax filing status. So that is a key piece of FTI. So even people who don't file a tax return have to provide consent and approval. But the good news is that what will come back is that the fact that they did not file a tax return. We hope for everyone that lived through the non-tax filer verification form for all of these years are sending up, a yip yip hooray because of it, because this will verify that without people having to do that form. That's the hope. That's the plan. So that's really, really good news. But we just need to emphasize over and over, everyone who's considered a contributor has to provide consent, even if they don't file taxes, or even if they file a foreign tax return. Okay, everybody has to do this. Now, what happens again is the filer, the contributor, provides consent. Information is transferred into the module, but again, it will not be visible. Here's why it's so important. This is why I keep harping on this. If an individual does not provide consent and approval, the student is ineligible for federal student aid. So it is not a case that people just say, yep, you know what? I don't want the federal government. I'm not going to give them consent to do that. I'm just going to enter my information manually. They could theoretically do that, but guess what? The student is not eligible for federal student aid if they do that. Okay, so you have to provide consent and approval, or the student is not going to be eligible for federal student aid. As mentioned, the IRS data, when it's accessed, will verify non-tax filing status. So we need non-tax filers to do that. In most cases, when that information is accessed, it is going to, again, provide information income information into the FTI module. There are a handful of cases where income information will still need to be provided manually. So the vast majority of people are going to find that the income questions are going to be provided by the direct data exchange. Okay, a few exceptions to that will be people who have experienced identity theft and the IRS is not allowed to share their information, or people who file a foreign tax return. The IRS doesn't have that information. So in those cases, a pathway will be opened up for people to provide the information manually, but it's a very limited number of circumstances. The vast majority of people will have all of their income information provided through the DDX, and that will go into that FTI module. Now, really great news is the fact that most of the other questions that are used to determine financial aid eligibility that don't come off a tax return are simply gone. There are a whole bunch of questions about untaxed income that are no longer on the FAFSA at all. So, for example, we used to have to provide the amount that we contributed to a retirement plan if it was pre-tax. Because that didn't show up on the FAFSA, we had to provide that manually. That's gone. That no longer has to be provided on the FAFSA. It no longer impacts financial aid eligibility. The things like if you were provided housing by someone, you had to list that as a dollar amount associated with that. That's all gone as well. So many questions have been removed. So it's going to make filing the FAFSA that much easier. All right, this one here, this is going to seem like a little bit of a trick question, okay, potentially. So I'm going to launch this one and the question and let me know what you think. So this question, Dad provides the majority of the student's financial support. So that's the determining factor now. Dad got married this summer. Does Dad's new spouse need to provide consent and approval on the FAFSA and therefore needs their own FSA ID? I'm watching the numbers go up. Looks like people read the question carefully. So that was good. That was good because it's one of those, you remember being in school and the teacher would say, read the whole question before you answer it. Okay. We've got about 50% participation, so we'll let it go a minute, 15 seconds more, and then we will move on. And I'll share the answers. Okay. It seems to be slowing down. So I think we will go and end here. All right. So I'm going to walk through each one of these. And the correct answer, just so you know in advance, is the fourth option. Yes, because they could not have filed a joint tax return. When we're talking about consent and approval, we're going to get real personal with families really quickly. Not only are we going to ask families, are you married? But we are going to follow that up almost immediately with what type of tax return did you file? Because that is so critical to whether or not people have to provide consent and approval. So the first one, no, because they weren't married in 2022. That's our base year of income information. As we said, it matters whether or not you're married on the day you filed the FAFSA. If you got married last weekend and file a FAFSA this weekend, your spouse's information is required on the FAFSA, even though you weren't married in that base year that the tax information is coming from. No, because they filed separate returns. Again, if they filed separate returns, they are always going to both need to have an FSA ID because they're both going to be contributors and they're both going to have to provide consent and approval for themselves. They can't provide it for each other. Yes, because all parents need to provide consent. That is not correct because still not every parent is going to need to provide consent and approval. Married couples who file a joint tax return, one parent can do that on behalf of the other. So the answer is yes, because they could not have filed a joint tax return in 2022. They just got married. So we know that they did not file a joint tax return. And so both of them are going to need to have their own FSA IDs and both provide consent and approval. And I know that was a tricky one. So thanks for bearing with me on that. But I wanted to kind of share those different scenarios because I think that's exactly what we're going to face as we move into the fall. All right, I'm trying to keep an eye on time here. But I do want to talk about one more segment. And then after we do this segment, we are going to move into kind of what we need to be laser focused on, in my opinion, in our opinion at FAME, for the fall to help students and families get ready. Because we've been all kind of theoretical so far. We're going to get it down to brass tacks. But first, let's talk about Pell Grant eligibility. So one of the nice things about the new FAFSA, and I think what was behind FAFSA simplification in large part, was they wanted to make more people eligible for a Pell Grant, and they wanted more people to know that they were going to be eligible for a Pell Grant even before they filed a FAFSA. So there are going to be 3 ways that Pell Grant eligibility is going to be determined. where students are going to be able to determine if they're eligible for maximum Pell before they file a FAFSA. It's going to be determined that they might be eligible for a Pell Grant based on a calculated Pell Grant, which is going to be based on their SAI. More is coming on all of this. Or they might be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. They'd be able to tell that before they file a FAFSA as well. So what I want to do next is go into a little bit more detail about that, but I'm going to just focus on the criteria for dependent students. Very similar criteria exists for independent students, and I will share resources after this training so that those of you who work with independent students can see the same sort of information that will be helpful when working with those students. But in the essence of time, just focused on dependents today. All right, so all of the people who meet any one of this criteria are going to be eligible for maximum Pell. One of the things that is so important with these changes is early awareness and transparency. So one of the things the federal government decided to do was to make Pell Grant eligibility tied to the poverty guideline tables. So eligibility for maximum and minimum Pell Grants is going to be tied to the poverty guideline tables and which table is applicable to that individual student and family, okay? So we're going to talk about that in more detail. But for maximum Pell, there are also a couple of other criteria that will automatically get a student to be eligible for maximum Pell. This one's big. So all of those parents out there who are not required, not who don't, who are required to file a tax return. And for the question that I know is coming, what happens when a parent is supposed to, but doesn't? Today, we're just going to focus on parents who are not required to file tax returns, because that's another whole conversation. Their student will automatically be eligible for maximum Pell Grant, okay? So you're working with a family, you know they aren't required to file taxes, you know that student is eligible for maximum Pell. That's it, okay? So they need to file the FAFSA to get it, but you know that if they do, they're going to be. Or if a single parent has an adjusted gross income that is less than 225% of poverty guidelines for family size, they're going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. If a parent is not a single parent, so let's say they're married, and they have an AGI between 0 but less than 175% of poverty guidelines, that student is going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Okay. So key pieces here: is the parent married or not married? So parent, single parent or not single parent. And how big is their family? So the guidelines, I'll show you in a moment, vary depending whether there are 2 people in the family or 6 people in the family. So I'll show that just a second. And then additionally, students who are under the age of 33, whose parents died serving in the armed forces after 9/11 or in the line of duty as a public safety officer, will automatically be eligible for maximum Pell Grant as well. So not going to focus on this one a lot today, but we do know, and 9/11 being just the other day, we do know that we have students out there who lost their parents as a result of all of that, or what happened after that, and they will be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Okay, all of these people eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Now, let's just say a student's not eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, then they will be considered for a calculated Pell Grant. A calculated Pell Grant is going to be calculated very similar to how a Pell Grant is currently, meaning that it's going to be based on the student's SAI, just like a Pell Grant is currently based on their EFC. That's the only way they're eligible now, okay? So that will be maintained, but it's going to get a little bit simpler. So how you can determine what a student might be eligible in terms of a Pell Grant is if you know what their SAI is once they file their FAFSA, they're going to see their SAI on that confirmation page. You can now, this is easier than the charts that used to exist, if you know what the maximum Pell Grant is, and for the upcoming year, it's $7,395. It could go up. We hope it goes up. And you know what their SAI is, you know what their Pell Grant is going to be, because it's the maximum Pell minus their SAI is what their calculated Pell amount is. I don't know why they didn't do this years ago. This is so much easier. And it may not for financial aid offices, but for those of us working with students, we're going to know that without having to look up this chart now, okay? So some students won't be eligible for max, but they might get a really significant Pell Grant based on their SAI. And then, as we mentioned, you can also determine eligibility for a maximum Pell Grant, a minimum Pell Grant. So a minimum Pell Grant will be 10% of a maximum Pell Grant. So this will change potentially every year. So a minimum Pell Grant, for example, if the Pell Grant, I just made the math easier. If a maximum Pell Grant is $7,500 for a given year, the minimum Pell is going to be $750. So it's 10% of the maximum. A student's parent, if they're a single parent, can have an AGI up to 325% of poverty guidelines for that family size and be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. Parents who are not a single parent and their AGI is less than 275% will be eligible, based on family size, will be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. Now, you might say, well, $750 isn't a lot, but keep in mind that being eligible for a Pell Grant, just any amount of Pell Grant, often opens up eligibility for all sorts of other types of programs and services. So this is really big as well. Okay, let me do this because I think this will help put it all into context. So early awareness is key in this. And so we today have the tables, the poverty guideline tables for 2022. That's the base year. That's the income year for the 24-25 FAFSA. So today we can work with a student and we can tell them whether they're going to be eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell. So here's an example of a dependent student whose parent is single parent. And in this case, I'm thinking that there's a single mom or dad that has 2 children. So there's 3 in the family. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to say 3 in the family. I'm checking to see whether they're eligible for maximum Pell. If that parent earns under $51,818, their student is eligible for maximum Pell. We know that before they file the FAFSA. Let's say their income is higher than that. We want to see if they're eligible for a minimum Pell. That parent can make up to $74,848, and their student is going to be eligible for a minimum Pell. So we can tell that today. What about if the student is from a household where the parents are married? So same thing, 2 kids. So married couple, 2 kids, so family size of 4. Student is eligible for a maximum Pell Grant if the income is less than $48,564 and eligible for a minimum Pell Grant of eligible for a minimum Pell Grant if the income is less than $76,313. So we know this in advance. And I think it's amazing when you look how high the income can be. Now, granted, huge family, but look how high the income can be, and students are still potentially going to be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. So when we talk about there is no income cutoff to file a FAFSA, we want everyone to file the FAFSA because these factors will impact whether or not they're eligible for a Pell Grant. It is not a case that if you earn over X number of dollars, you might as well not bother. That has never been the case, to be honest with you, and it is absolutely not the case going forward. I'm going to share those tables. They were on that link, but we will send you the tables so you can look up and post them to your wall if you would like to do that. Okay, our last poll before we kind of get into here's what we need to be doing for the fall. So this last poll is about Pell eligibility. What info is not needed to determine if a dependent student is eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant before the FAFSA is filed? Marital status of the parent, number of family members, number of students in college, and the appropriate tax filing year. Okay, you guys are brilliant. This is awesome.
They're listening, Myla.
Yeah, this is great. Okay. So let me share the results. So 85% of you said number in college is not a piece of information that is needed. So probably word has gotten around that number in college is no longer going to impact eligibility for federal financial aid. And the reason is because they prioritized what was most important. And they prioritized being able to use the poverty tables to predict Pell eligibility, to really make sure that that early awareness opportunity was there and we could share this information long before a student files a FAFSA. The poverty tables don't take into account the number in college. So that's why the number in college has been removed from the formula for federal student aid. Now, it still is going to be asked on the FAFSA. So when you file your FAFSA or you're working with students and you say, well, geez, Milo said that the number in college didn't matter anymore, it is going to be asked because schools can still use it for their own institutional aid. And we want families to know that if they've got multiple families in college, I literally had a conversation with someone this morning, next year, 4 kids in college. They are going to want to do a special circumstance appeal and let the colleges know, even though they can see it on the FAFSA, they're going to want to follow up with them and let them know that financially, this is something that they'd like the school to look at. Okay. All right. So deep breath, anyone. Nikki, are there any questions? Let me check time here. We've got 15 minutes left. I think we can get this last section done in 15 minutes. Is there a question that's critical that we want before we continue?
Someone asked a question that I got Sunday night MDI about how aid offers are going to go out without the FAFSA. And we know CSS profile is available in October. So the schools that require that will have it. But I know we've got some financial aid offices on the call. We know that aid offers are going to be delayed this year because of the delay of the FAFSA, but I don't know if anyone has anything else to add to that. I would love to know so I can spread the word to folks. And I have a few more questions. Just, I see them in the chat. I just am getting back to them as soon as possible.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make it possible for attendees to now chat with the hosts and panelists. So if you want to respond in the chat directly to Nikki about the question she just asked, you can go ahead and do that. Okay. So let's do our kind of I didn't number them, but our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things as a result of what we've talked about. Again, we only talked about some of the changes today. So at the end, I'm going to share, as I mentioned, more about other trainings. So I hope that you'll stay with me just long enough to finish this out so that you will know what we have coming up. If not, I'm just going to shortcut it though and tell you that if you go to famemaine.com/events, you're going to see other events that we have coming up. But for the fall, this is what we would like to do with students and partner with all of you to make sure that these are the topics of conversation that are happening with students and their families to help them get ready for the FAFSA in December. So one thing is to identify contributors. So right up front, again, getting personal really quickly, if we can help students understand who needs to get an FSA ID, so that they can get one ahead of time, we think that would be really helpful. So our events in the fall are going to have a component where we actually help people create FSA IDs then and there, because it's so important that they get this done ahead of time. So again, parents who are married and file a joint tax return, only one parent needs to have an FSA ID because they can consent to a consent and approval on behalf of their spouse. If parents are married and file 22 taxes separately, they did file 22 taxes separately, or if they live together but aren't married, both parents. So if you're working with students that are already in college, you could have a scenario where last year only one parent needed an FSA ID if they were married and filed taxes separately, but this year both of the parents are going to. Okay, so having that conversation I think will be helpful. If parents are divorced, separated, or never married, and don't live in the same household, the parent who provides the most financial support will be the parent on the FAFSA. So again, that could be different for currently enrolled students than it was this year. And so we just need to have those conversations to make sure people know who for the upcoming year is going to need to complete the FAFSA and who's going to be considered a contributor. Again, if parents are remarried as of the day the FAFSA is filed, then their spouse will need their own FSA ID unless they file the joint tax return. So again, if they've been married for years, they file a joint tax return, they're like that first scenario that we talked about, married couples filing joint tax returns, only one parent needs to have an FSA ID. But if they're recently married, it's probably likely that they did not file a joint tax return. And so each of those people will need their own FSA ID. Okay, that was number one. Number two is once we've identified contributors, we want all of them to create their FSA IDs. So for contributors who don't have an FSA ID yet, we want them to create an account early. at least a week ahead of doing the FAFSA. So no harm in doing it now. They can go do it today. And we would love that. And we have forms available so that we have instructions, and I'll share a link to those in the follow-up email. We'd love to get those done sooner rather than later. And again, that's something we're going to build into all of our fall events. So to create an FSA ID account, you go to studentaid.gov. Keep in mind that individuals do need a unique email address. So let's just say that two parents share an email address and both of those parents need an FSA ID, that someone's going to have to create another email address, because you are going to have your own unique email address in order to create an FSA ID, okay? Students should not use their high school email address because guess what's going to happen next summer is they're probably going to lose access to their high school email address. So if students haven't already, we'd love to have students create a Gmail account or a Yahoo account that they will use, throughout high school, through college, and beyond that they will continue to have access to. So that's really important that they do that. Individuals, when they set up their FSA ID, again, have to have an email address. They will ideally also provide their cell phone or mobile phone number as well, just so they'll have a variety of ways of verifying getting a verification code. So they can choose, do they want a verification code via text or via email? If they provide both pieces of information and verify them, that's just going to give them more options. Now, we have contributors who already have an FSA ID. So what we want those people to do is we want them to log into their studentaid.gov account to make sure they know their username and password. That's a good thing to just periodically do that to make sure you still remember it. Hopefully people have written it down and they have it somewhere safe. But if not, it is a relatively easy thing to retrieve a username and reset a password. Again, if you have access to your email and cell phone number, it is relatively easy. So it's great for people to check that out now in case there's any issue. We have time to get it resolved. Now, if an FSA ID account was set up without an email address, which has been possible throughout the last several years, you neither needed an email or a cell phone number, but not both. If someone set it up with only a cell phone number, they do need to go in and add an email and verify that, okay? And again, verification is just getting that verification code. So that's something we'd want them to do this fall. So they can go back to studentaid.gov and update their email address or add their email address under settings. So this is what studentaid.gov looks like currently. So when people are going to go to create an FSA ID, they're just going to go to, again, studentaid.gov. They're going to click on create account. If they already have an account, they want to try to log in, they're going to click on log in. So great stuff for people to be doing sooner rather than later, and making sure that everything is set to go so that when December rolls around, FSA IDs are created and working. Next, step 3, I guess you could say, is we want to have these conversations starting about who's going to start the FAFSA. This can be a game time decision, but it's good, I think, to be talking about this concept of whoever starts it having to invite the other parties to join. So, a student might be the person who's taking the lead on this, and the student is going to start the FAFSA and invite their parents. But they will need their parent's social security number in order to do that. And some parents won't be comfortable with that. In other cases, it therefore might make more sense if the parent starts the FAFSA and then invites the student, because the parent's probably more likely to have the student's SSN. So that's going to vary by family and circumstances. So we'll try to provide some additional guidance on this, just kind of like pros and cons as we go through the fall. But I think talking about that sooner rather than later is a good thing, so that parents know that this question is going to be coming from their kids and how they want to handle it. Because again, what must be provided in order to invite someone and connect those two pieces of the FAFSA together are legal name, date of birth, social security number, and an email address. Another thing that's super important this fall is just to convey the importance of consent and approval, that all contributors are going to have to provide consent and approval, or the student is going to be ineligible for federal student aid. That's black and white. There is no getting around this. Again, including non-tax filers, those who have filed for an extension, if someone's filed for an extension, we want them to do that as well. And what's really cool is the FAFSA, yes, you could say the FAFSA will the process will keep going out and looking for the tax return to be filed. So we want to be sure everyone checks that. Now, if someone doesn't, because they don't understand the importance of it, and believe me, we've seen the first slides of the new FAFSA. It is hard to miss that you have to do this. And there's a couple of places people can provide that consent. But let's just say someone does submit a FAFSA without doing that. They can go back into the FAFSA and then provide and update it, provide consent and approval after the FAFSA has initially been submitted, make those updates and then resubmit it once they realized, that, I should have done that the first time. And then last but not least, I just think we want to be talking about Pell Grant eligibility being expanded. It certainly is, of the things we've talked about today, I think there's a couple other things that take priority, but I think the importance of being able to have people know if a student's eligible for a Pell Grant before they even file a FAFSA might be what it takes to get them to file a FAFSA. And so to provide that reassurance, I think can be super important. So again, you can check out and share the Pell lookup tables. Basically, they're the federal poverty guidelines, but they've made it so it's a little bit easier to use. We'll include that in our follow-up email, but I think just making this a point of conversation is really a good and positive thing as we're moving through the fall. And to be honest with you, once we kind of get used to the changes related to the FAFSA, this is going to be something we're going to talk a lot more about and really highlight, because I think this could be a game changer for families who have younger students and think maybe that, college isn't possible. All right, upcoming trainings and workshops and stuff like that. And I should have changed this. I meant the title says upcoming training sessions. What this first slide is events for students and parents. So we're doing at the moment, this might terrify Nikki because she probably has already come to realize this. We have over 55 sessions already scheduled, and I know we're still working on a few for the fall. And what we're calling them are financial aid workshops. The first step's free and fast. So basically, this is when you go and you register for one, this is what it says. And the idea of these sessions is we'll provide an abbreviated overview of financial aid, not our hour-long session. We're thinking maybe a half an hour. And then we'll spend the second half hour creating email accounts where we need to, and then creating FSA IDs so that we know that people actually get those done and are ready to go. So we are saying on our website when people register and when we're going to be advertising this, to encourage people to bring their laptop with them and that they're going to need access to it. And again, we want to be sure that people know that they need to provide their name, social, and date of birth as it appears on their social security number. They don't need to bring their card, but they need to be 100% sure of that number. So we'd love it if you share this with your families and students, and they can go to famemaine.com/events and they can see what's available. There's no registration required here, but they can identify one that's going to work for them. Events continue to be added, so today's list is not comprehensive. We will continue to update that as we go through the fall. This is the training that's coming. So one of the things that we're doing are FAFSA Fridays. So these are trainings specifically for all of you. Today, as you can tell, we tried to get a lot in a short period of time. And especially if you're brand new to these changes, your head's probably like ready to explode. So what we thought we would do is offer a series of 4 sessions, one in September, October, November, and December, and break this up a little bit more. So our first one is this Friday. It's going to be a lot of what we talked about today, but then in October, we'll go more into expanded pathways for students with challenging circumstances. So some really great stuff there for students who are homeless and in foster care. We'll talk about all of that. We'll talk about Pell eligibility again. And then in November, hold on, Mila, we'll talk more about some of the changes to the formula that we didn't touch on today, and so a little bit more about FSA IDs and all of that. Maybe we'll know how people who don't have an SSN will get FSA IDs at that point. And then in December, we'll figure it out as we get closer. We'll want to share whatever's most important at that point in time. And we do have a bunch of resources available on our website. We have a page that is specifically dedicated to FAFSA simplification. It's famemaine.com/FAFSA simplification. And there you can find previously recorded presentations. We did a June Wednesday webinar on this. We did 3 summer training sessions on this. We did today's. We're going to do those FAFSA Fridays. All of those are recorded and all of those are available on our website at that location. And then other information that you will see on our website. And again, the event listings, famemaine.com/events for both the sessions for students and parents and the trainings that we will be doing for all of you going forward. And then my last comment for today, unless there are questions, is that next month's Wednesday webinar is going to be on another really hot topic, and that is going to be Get Ready, Get Set, Repay. As you may know, federal student loans are going back into repayment in October. And so the fabulous Nikki Vachon is going to be doing that session, and she's going to share what everyone needs to know about loans going back into repayment, including what to do if students are struggling with how they're going to make those payments. Okay, we did it, an hour. That was a lot. Nikki, anything that you think we want to share before we close for the day?
So I'm not, well, let me see. So there was a question someone had asked about if we need to prove that someone provided more financial support, which parent did if the parents are separated. I've never known of a reason why you'd have to prove that, but unless the school had some conflicting information, I would say.
Yeah, exactly, Nikki. This question came up last night when I had a session as well. And the reality is that when people fill out a FAFSA and provide that FSA ID at the end as their signature, they're saying that they're telling the truth. And if they aren't telling the truth, they're subject to, lots of bad things happening to them. So a lot of these things are on your honor. It's basically, you're acknowledging that you're telling the truth, and if not, you're in trouble. So we want families to take this seriously, but we also don't expect that families are going to have to prove this to financial aid offices, again, unless there's conflicting information, and I'm trying to think of a good scenario where that would be conflicting information, but, let's just say that somehow a financial aid office knew, that dad was providing all of the financial support, but mom was filing the FAFSA. I guess if they get wind of that, they might investigate it, but just on the surface, no, schools are not going to be asking families to provide documentation of that. Okay.
And just another, I've answered these already. I just thought they were worth mentioning. If there's a kind of a blended family and there are stepchildren, we determine which household we're going to list the parent information on the FAFSA. If there are stepchildren in that household, would they be considered as part of family size?
Yeah, so we didn't touch on this. This is one of the things we'll touch on in one of the 4 follow-up sessions. We'll get a little deeper into a few of these things. But family size now is going to come from the tax return. So that is going to be one of the pieces that is considered FTI. So it's going to look basically at that tax return. It's going to calculate a family size based on the number of dependents listed, whether it was a single or joint return. And that's what's going to live in that FTI module. Now, the hard part is you're not going to be able to see that, which is why we still would like people to have their tax returns in front of them when they file a FAFSA. But if you're looking at your tax return and you say, oh, no, this year my family size is actually different because now there are stepchildren and they are in our family and we are providing, I think it's more than half of their support in order to be assumed in the family according to IRS regulations, then people can update that. So you won't see family size. It will be calculated based on a tax return. It won't be visible, but it will be updatable. How's that for clear as mud?
Well, I think that's important to mention because my husband, as part of his divorce decree, they had to, because we have 3 kids, we would flip years that we could have more of the kids as dependents. So having the tax return handy is good to know. Does that actually reflect our household size? Because that's what's going to be added unless we change it, right? Exactly. On the FAFSA, we get a chance to change it. But for us, that would have been important to have our taxes handy.
And we're filing the FAFSA using 22 income information. So I don't know about you, that's, I don't remember, I don't have that exact scenario, but I don't remember 22 tax information. I mean, that was months ago now. So having that tax return handy, I think will really help. So that's why you're going to see us talking about still, ideally bringing that for those situations. But most people will not have to enter any income or tax information. All right. Well, Nikki, I'm going to stop.
Our best events for parents and students to attend virtual financial aid information sessions, they're going to get the same thing, either virtual or live. So it really just is up to the student or the family, whatever they prefer. We're happy seeing both either way.
Now, there's a little, it's funny because we've talked a lot about this internally. We have a fabulous marketing team that makes sure that we are consistent and talking about things in a way that makes sense to people. This fall, we have financial aid information sessions. We don't have many of those left, but those, like we had one last night, we have one next Thursday. Those are going to be just kind of regular financial aid overviews. That's going to be an hour-long session, kind of here's what we want you to know. It's the financial aid workshops where we're going to do an abbreviated session, and then we're going to actually do FSA IDs or create FSA IDs. Again, as Nikki just said, those are going to be exactly the same. We will do them in person. The vast majority will be in person. We will be adding a handful, we haven't done it yet, a handful of virtual financial aid workshops as well. So today you won't see any of those workshops. Sorry, the sun's out behind me, but there will be some added. Students and parents do not need to register for in-person events. They do need to register for virtual events because we need them to have the link, okay? Nikki, I'm going to stop recording, but hold on.